Thank you all for being here. This is the Public Safety Committee, and we're going to get a briefing on the Police Department, Crime Lab, and Forensics. We're going to get an update on that. And I guess Susan Farag is going to lead us off, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. The primary driver of this today is going to be a PowerPoint presented by the police department over showing the different aspects of the crime lab. In your packet, I've got more information on budget items and staffing issues to go through the less fun stuff, I guess. So I'll just let the police department start with their presentation.
So, good afternoon.
If you could please introduce yourself.
Yes,
Yeah,
I'm Assistant Chief Marcus Jones. I'm the Chief of the Investigative Services Bureau. Oh. Yes, there we go. Assistant, yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Ward. I'm the captain who is assigned as the director of the Criminal Investigations Division, and thank you for your time today.
Yes, my name is Francis Shafari. I am the laboratory director of the Montgomery County Police Crime Lab.
I'm Lieutenant Jim Brown. I'm the Deputy Director of Criminal Investigations, overseeing, partially overseeing the crime lab also.
thank you all for being here. Please.
Okay. I think we got a couple. So thank you all for having us, and we're going to just give you a brief overview of the crime lab and the significance that this lab has to public safety in Montgomery County. Clearly, we have some folks that do some phenomenal work, and they are really the ones that actually are very fruitful to us for successful prosecutions and finding the right individuals who commit crimes here in Montgomery County. And so we want to kind of give you a little bit of a breakdown of some of the things that we're facing with in today's world of technology. As introduced here, Frank Joffrey is our crime lab director. As we look at the top of our sheet with response to our personnel, and Frank does a phenomenal job of just coordinating all of the different units that we have. We have 5 different units that are connected to our crime lab. We have, of course, our crime scene unit, which is also has been known as our forensic services teams. They are the ones who actually go out on our crime scenes and actually collect evidence, take photographs, and submit that evidence to our lab. We have our pattern evidence unit that also do a phenomenal job in collecting those types of evidence. And we'll get into a little bit more particular detail as you all request. We also have our electronic crimes unit, which is now proven to be a very challenging unit as it comes to dealing with computer crimes, cell phones, all electronic components that actually will actually hold evidence, and we have storage. We'll deal with issues as it relates to storage and what actually curtails an investigator to have to actually go in and actually be able to get this information out that we need to utilize for court and for investigative purposes. And of course, probably the one that gets the most, I would say, recognition is our forensics biology unit. That's our DNA lab. We have some phenomenal people that work in this particular lab. We've had some phenomenal successes over the past few years in response to DNA cases that, and what we must say is that DNA is collected almost on all types of crime scenes, to the most serious crimes, and in some cases into the not so serious crimes, such as maybe from our property crimes. But with the amount of DNA that's being collected, it does require to have the resources in order to be able to test that DNA. And there's a priority list that we have to kind of put into play due to the fact of dealing with our most serious crimes and then pushing those down to our less serious crimes, depending upon the workload. But there's always, and sometimes there is a backlog for collecting not so much collecting the evidence, but testing that evidence and making sure that evidence is into our system. And then we also have our forensic chemistry unit. And our forensic chemistry unit actually is our drug lab, where they are required to test the many different types of drugs that are seized in Montgomery County. Each case that is criminally charged requires that testing to be completed prior to that individual actually going to trial or pleading guilty. If that's not done in a timely manner, that could have impact on prosecutorial cases. And so it's vitally important that they maintain their status and make sure that they're up to speed on their cases in order to actually to be efficient in that manner. All right, so that's a brief overview of what the actual crime lab looks like from Montgomery County's aspect.
Okay. Do you want to go through the presentation itself, or?
Sure.
Okay.
Did you guys want to go through this in the different
More
slides?
detail? Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll let Captain Ward and Frank Joffrey actually let them kind of take it from here, as they'll go into a more distinctive component about what actually occurs with each particular unit. And if you have any questions, you can direct those to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Cap.
Thanks again for hosting us today and listening to our presentation about the Montgomery County Police Crime Lab. One of the first things I wanted to mention was in reference to the personnel themselves. The scientists that work in our crime lab are extremely dedicated professionals, and they are scientists. The education that's required in their disciplines and in their fields, and then the training that's required is it's extreme. It's a lot. And while they're all scientists and working in one crime lab, the disciplines are very distinct from each other. They all have science backgrounds, but there's obviously a big difference between the chemistry in the drug lab and the biology in the DNA lab. And that's actually one of the areas I wanted to touch on for just a minute, was the education and then the training and the certifications that are needed by the people that work in our lab. Obviously, they all come with college educations and specific backgrounds. The training in each of our units is both beneficial on the back end because they're highly trained, but it's also a challenge in terms of hiring and getting them trained, and then maintaining our staffing levels. So the crime lab is, it answers to a number of different places in terms of the certifications that are used by the lab. Maryland has actual law under COMAR that affects the operations of crime labs within the state of Maryland. The National Institute of Standards and Technology set standards for laboratories in the United States. There's an organization, and Frank can speak about this a little more, but there's an organization called ISO, which is in France, that sets certification for laboratories worldwide. And then we have an accrediting body that is similar to CALIA in how it affects the police department, but this is specific for crime laboratories within the state of Maryland.
Just as I said, CLE is a certification for the law enforcement people, yeah.
For the
Sorry,
entire
yeah,
department.
yeah.
There's another one that is just providing a certification to our laboratory. And the standards are rigorous, and they actually come in and do inspections throughout the year. And these are all certifications and standards that must be met and maintained by our laboratory to operate, and the number of organizations that we answer to is large, is my bottom line there. So as a result of all of those policies and standards that are, and practices that are in place, the training required by the different members of the laboratory is also rigorous. So, and it could go from anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, and that's after we hire somebody. And what that means is when we hire somebody, even if they come to us with experience, there is still at least a 6-month period of time where they're going to be going through training within our laboratory, which means that they're not producing a work product for us because they're in their training and certification stage. It also means another scientist has to oversee that, which takes them away from their work, everyday work. And during this process, tests and going on, certifications and so forth. That's a lot of investment we have, and it's for a good cause. but we're speaking about a small community of professionals that are out there. So the challenge we face is once we hire somebody and once we train them, keeping them is tough because everybody else is competing to then
Sure.
take them away. So that's one of the challenges we face. And we have lost people to this process, to other agencies. We've also gained employees from other agencies through this process. But my main point to all that was just to highlight the these are dedicated professionals who are scientists who work in their fields. And while they're all scientists, there's a big difference between latent prints, firearms examination, which we refer to as pattern analysis. That field actually requires more than just education and experience. It involves an inherent inside talent to be able to compare things and make connections between them. And then, like I said, the chemistry lab is very heavy on that portion of science. Electronic crimes is another one that's very heavy with the certifications. That's one area of the lab where we use sworn officers and not civilians. And the training process there is up to 2 years as well to acquire and maintain all the certification on doing examinations of computers versus cell phones versus thumb drives versus hard drives. Each step along the way is another period of time. Ours is a fairly decent-sized electronic crime unit compared to others in the region. I know that there are other departments that have them, but it's a very cutting-edge part of crime laboratory service. And it's changing. That one is changing every day. As you know, when we receive updates on our cell phones, which happen frequently, those are typically security updates that are being provided. And every time we receive an update on our phone, that creates a new challenge for our detectives to be able to go into phones and retrieve evidence out of them. One of the important factors I wanted to talk about with the Electronic Crimes Unit is how they do these searches. I think from the general public, if they just knew that we did this, they might assume that we're just randomly searching people's cell phones. It's not the case. In almost all of the cases, we are actually executing a search and seizure warrant upon an electronic device. So there's a check and balance where a detective who has to be investigating a crime, and then they have to apply to a judge with a warrant, and they have to link the crime, the probable cause associated with the crime, with evidence that could be in the phone. So it's not even like we have to have a crime and then we can just search the phone. We have to have a link that says there's evidence in there. And then the judge issues a warrant, which in effect orders us to conduct the search and seizure, and then they execute that warrant on the cell phone. And they are not frontline investigators. The cases that they're working are not their cases. They are actually working in a support capacity for other frontline detectives from our other investigative
All right,
divisions.
so in that case, the police officer believes that they should be searching that phone. The person who owns the phone still is holding the phone?
No, the phone has been seized.
So it's actually been seized and is being held, though you can't look in it
Right.
until, I see, okay.
And there's a couple ways that could happen. We could seize a cell phone incident to arrest, where we arrest somebody for committing a crime and they have their cell phone with them. We could recover it as a result of another search warrant. So if we executed a search warrant on a vehicle or a house or a location, it could be recovered as a result of that initial search warrant. Sometimes they do consensual searches, or they'll do a search of a victim's cell phone with consent. But the vast majority of the searches that they conduct are as a result of executing search warrants that have been issued by a judge.
Okay.
And once again, they're in a day-by-day race to stay up with technology. As the amount of data that's stored on phones increases, our phones, as everybody knows, are tied to almost every part of our life, and as a result, they're also tied frequently to crimes that we're investigating. Our crime scene unit is our CSI, basically. These are men and women who respond out to crime scenes and document the evidence that are there. They take pictures, they collect evidence, they do swabs of fluids, look for fingerprints. When they're not responding to crime scenes, they will process evidence that other officers and detectives have submitted to them. So if an officer seizes a piece of evidence and they want it to be tested for fingerprints and swabbed for DNA, they'll submit it to our crime scene unit. And that's what they do on a normal day-to-day basis when they're not responding out to a crime scene to process that. They're on call 24/7, they're very busy, and they're very good at what they do as well. Biology is another, just like the electronic crimes, is another field that's changing every single day as technology increases. Earlier, last year actually, the biology lab was able to get successfully get a DNA profile off of an expended shell casing in a homicide investigation. That was the first time in Montgomery County where we were able to swab a shell from a bullet that had been fired and still recover a DNA profile off of it. And that was because the machines that they use and the technology they use had advanced that it was sensitive enough to be able to do that. Prior to that, we almost never got DNA or fingerprints off expended shell casings. When the gun is fired, the heat is enough to burn most of it off of there. Touch, yeah, from loading the gun. They are
Unbelievable.
very good at what they do.
Yeah.
And that technology is increasing every day as well. And DNA is now becoming more and more a piece of evidence in many cases, all the way from homicides down to theft from vehicles and auto theft. We're collecting DNA and analyzing it. All of the disciplines use specialized databases, and many of them are maintained and had been created by other entities. So, for example, the biology lab uses CODIS, which is created and run by the FBI, and there's certain standards. In addition to all the other standards by the accrediting agencies, we also have standards set by the agencies that own the software that we're using. So CODIS has its own set of policies and standards that they have to abide by, and they also have to be trained on. In our latent print unit, we use RAFIS, which is a regional automated fingerprint identification system. In our firearm and tool marks examination unit, we're using NIBIN, which is owned and run by the ATF. So they are using that system to enter pictures of expended shell casings for comparison, not only in Montgomery County, but across the country. So.
Very good. Did either of you gentlemen have anything to add on this? Though we do have a couple questions on and you touched on them, but on the there's two positions of the lab. I guess I don't know if there's more than two now, but if there's two positions that you're trying to fill, any ideas to when that might happen?
So I just
I
confirmed.
know you're trying your best. I'm
are.
not trying to,
It was just confirmed today for me that one of the two supervisor positions that we have open has been exempted to be filled. And we'll be submitting the paperwork to start that process this week. We're waiting for an exemption on the other one. We do have other positions within the lab that are currently open. The sergeant in charge of the electronic crimes unit retired as of today. We have a corporal who is acting as a sergeant right now in that position, but we have that position. We're going to announce that with a position.
and that can be filled right away. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean,
Because that's
as
internal.
as fast as the process will allow for it.
Right. We have two current latent print examiner positions that are open. We have, the new budget is giving us one more scientist in biology. I assume we won't be able to ask for an exemption for that until July 1st. But that will be another position. The supervisor positions are actually going to add, those are new positions, so they will add a body both to biology and chemistry. Frank, what am I missing in terms of
Did you
openings?
mention crime scene?
We have two or three.
4.
We have 4 openings in our crime scene unit. Yeah, so that's one of our areas, one of our units that's the most challenging to keep staffed, and it's because of the movement within that field with other
Right.
other
Well,
departments.
and of course, we're going through the budget process now, but I would sincerely hope, and I believe my colleagues will probably agree with me, that you would get your additional person so that, for the 2020 budget. But what I would suggest, once that happens, and I would ask the committee to send a note to whoever, to the county executive or to our colleagues here, that lets you start the process of actually advertising it, so July 1 or something, you can actually if possible, have somebody hired rather than wait till July 1 and then start the process. So we know that this is so needed. And you certainly touched on the forensic biology unit and what you need for that position. And how about the backlogs? How are we doing on that for the forensic?
All of the disciplines within the crime laboratory operate with a backlog. There's never a case where there's scientists sitting around waiting for work to come in. But it doesn't apply the same for all of the disciplines. So, for example, in the firearms examination unit, there are 14 handguns that are currently backlogged, or 14 firearms, backlogged, waiting to be test fired. And what happens is new cases may come in that leave that 14, so they're chipping away at it. All of the disciplines use a hierarchy of what they're doing. They prioritize how they test things. Chemistry is a little bit of an anomaly because they only test narcotics or suspected controlled dangerous substances when they receive a summons from court, for the most part. And the reason for that is that they don't want to do unnecessary testing that's not going to be needed for something in court. So when they receive a summons from court to appear for a court date, then they begin the testing on that evidence, that drug evidence for that court case. There are some outliers where they will test something when it's not related to an actual trial that's coming up, but those are rare. So that's a unique situation in the chemistry lab, and they end up testing about 25% of the drugs that are submitted by the department. The backlog in the crime scene unit, where they're processing evidence submitted by other officers, and it's almost always for fingerprints and for DNA, is also the backlogs are moving targets. They change a lot. Frank, do you know what the backlog is there?
Yeah, I was just looking
I'll
for
come
that,
back. I'll come back to that one.
information for
I'll
that.
come back to that one. Electronic crimes is facing a heavy backlog. However, about 41% of the devices that are in that backlog are currently being worked on. And a lot of times they use special software to go into the phone, and there's no telling how long it will take. So about 41% of them are being worked on to some capacity, but it's impossible to say how long it will take. They have a very strong prioritization of what they test and when. They have 3 categories. Part 1, violent felonies, murders are up top, and then they move down through the other crimes.
Right.
The biology lab is also facing a backlog. We also sometimes send cases out to a private lab, and typically those are property crimes, perk kits that were never tested for investigative reasons initially. And sometimes the outside laboratory is able to do something that the internal laboratory can't do. It's important for me to know, for me to tell you that when they do send something out to the external lab, it still takes our scientist about 25% of the time as it would have taken if they had kept it internally. And that has to do with preparing the sample to be sent out. Then when it comes back, they have to analyze the results, possibly enter it into CODIS, and handle evidence, and keep the chain of custody. So,
In order for us to take ownership of the case.
Can you touch your microphone, please?
In order for us to take ownership of the case, we actually have to technically review the report from the outsource vendor and agree with their conclusions. And so that's a
Sure.
large part of that.
And for the electronics crimes unit, we know that you're having a backup storage capacity issue, I guess, and you need redundancy and dedicated. And we know that the county executive has a new CIP project that's going to include some from a master lease. Does that include your crime lab as well? Do you know?
I am not clear if the new CIP includes the electronic crimes storage of electronic data. However, since I submitted this packet, I've spoken with OMB and DTS, who maintains the server that we store evidence on. And my understanding is that as more space is needed, they're adding hard drives to the dedicated server.
So it's not quite as bad as you thought when you,
Exactly.
right, good.
Could I just, I'm
And I
sorry.
could also say that we have, the electronic crimes detectives have a strong relationship with DTS. they're constantly speaking and working on that issue.
Good. Go ahead, Susan.
I'm sorry, I just want to update the committee. I had originally stated that that CIP project would be reviewed by the GEO committee on April 22nd. With the chair's permission, that's been rescheduled to a joint committee, joint GEO and Public Safety Committee meeting on April 30th.
Okay.
And we can gather more information on
Good, I
that to
think
see
it-
if it applies or whether or not it might be an appropriate funding vehicle to help expedite some issues.
It's fine with me. It doesn't affect me at all. I sit on both committees, so I was going to be there anyhow. And of course, with CSI, I guess everybody knows how to do your job much better than you all do, right? Because everybody sees it on television. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Gentlemen, did you have anything to ask or add?
Well, I want to begin by thanking you for this really remarkably important work on a lot of different levels. As the newest member of the Public Safety Committee, I've just been blown away by the level of depth that our law enforcement agencies exhibit every day. And I want to touch on a little bit of the personnel and the retention, because, you know, that's an issue sort of across the board, but particularly in very sophisticated, complex work like this. And pardon my ignorance here, but do we have partnerships in place with universities and systems that are out there, both locally and maybe regionally? And if so, what do those look like? And is there an opportunity for us to enhance some of those relationships so that we can develop a pipeline further upstream?
The short answer is yes. And I'm done. No. We do have relationships with higher education institutions. One of them two actually just recently came about. Historically, interns sound like a great idea. Our issue with having an intern who is at the college level come into our crime lab is that we can't allow them to handle any of the evidence, because then they become part of the chain of custody, and they're not going to be around to testify in court later. So then when we had interns, the question became, well, what do we do to help them with their education, but also benefit our side? And the answer has been, that's a challenge. It's a challenge because we can't have them handle the evidence. But we do still host interns. Recently, we've had conversations with two institutions,
yes, Loyola and
without
GW.
specifically naming them, who have come up with alternative and new ideas on how to do this. One of them is looking, and they're also interested in not only providing an education for their students and getting them hands-on experience, but one of the institutions we're working with is looking farther forward, and they want to help create a pool of applicants that are already, beyond just having a college education, trained where they might meet some of these standards that we have to train internally. One of them has to do with training people who are already in the field. The other
Yes.
one has to do with, they actually have the same equipment that we have, and they would be interested in training the students how to use the same equipment that we use in addition to their normal college education. And that's an interesting prospect. Then we would have somebody who might be ready to meet the accreditation standards a lot sooner than if we had to train them ourselves. So,
And one of them deals with grad students being the interns also.
right.
So they're
these would
already
be
further
people-
along in their careers, not like, hey, I'm gonna do CSI, and in my first year, I'm gonna be an intern. It's gonna be further down in their career. They've already proven themselves, to be further along.
And both of these institutions weren't necessarily looking at crime scene. They were looking at biology, chemistry, and the other elements.
Fortunately, the two institutions are interested in two different sets of disciplines. One of them is interested in biology and chemistry. The other one is interested in firearms and latent prints. So that actually works out to our benefit. The real issue, not so much for biology and chemistry, but for latents and firearms, is that there is not a normal synergy with any sort of area of science like there is for biology and chemistry. So that's a little more of a reach for that one. Now, they have some ideas, and I hesitate to share them in a public forum, but we think that they might yield, some good candidates in the future.
That's fantastic. The connection to Ancestry.com and some of the other social media sites that are out there has opened up a whole new world and is absolutely been an asset in helping to engage cases, but the legality of that is murky. And so how do you guys work with the Attorney General's office or the state's attorney's office to sort of stay ahead of the curve on issues like that? Because clearly it's something that we want, but from a legislative perspective, if you could just articulate where that murkiness is currently and where you anticipate that moving forward.
May I?
Yeah.
I don't think it's actually as murky as it seems. I will tell you that the first case I heard about last year, the year before, came out of California. And when I first read about it in the news, I thought to myself, oh, what did they do? And then I found out what they did, and it answered a lot of my questions. So it is not a case, in that case or any of the other ones that I'm aware of, where the police are accessing the databases of private companies with a search warrant or without permission or anything like that. So what happens is private citizens who engage these genealogy-type companies are interested in tracking their genealogy or possibly locating other relatives that they're not aware of. And there's more than one company out there that provide these services. We see them advertised on TV and in different places. So then these people who are interested in tracking where they came from and where their possible relatives might be come to the realization that what if somebody I'm related to is doing the same thing I am, but they're using one of the other companies? So another company set up an open source website on the internet for people to voluntarily post their DNA codes to, in the hopes that if they're trying to connect with unknown relatives, they would do the same. When they do this,
You're saying that did happen, or I thought you said if that has happened?
that does happen.
does happen.
Yes, yeah. This website exists. It's open source, and people go there and post their DNA code, with the hope that if any of their lost relatives or unknown relatives are doing the same thing, but we're using a different first company,
Right.
they would do the same thing and put theirs there
Right, got it.
to hook up with relatives. It's voluntary for people to do that. There's a disclaimer explaining to anybody that does this that they're doing it voluntarily and they're doing so on an open source website that anybody can access. And since the police started using this, they've added another disclaimer that says that the website can be accessed by law enforcement. So law enforcement's not going into the computers of these companies that are doing the genealogy. Law enforcement is taking a look at open source data online that's put there by people voluntarily with the understanding that it's open source and with the understanding that law enforcement can also see this. There's yet another layer to this. Are you going to jump in here?
If I could. So when we say law enforcement sort of jumping in, what happens is that we're actually connecting with the companies. We're not the ones who are actually going in looking at the information that's on open source. Mm-hmm. So we have a DNA, for example, we have a cold case. I'll give you a case in point. We had the case in Germantown over the past few years where we had an elderly rapist who had raped on 4 different occasions on one elderly female victim twice. And we had actively worked that investigation for years, and we were really just up against the wall. We just could not. We had DNA evidence collected, but there was no DNA match in our system. That for individuals who have been arrested and their information had been uploaded to CODIS, there was no match. So what we did was we utilized this as a pretty much like a pilot case to actually kind of see how this would actually work. And so what we did was we reached out to the company called Parabon in an attempt to try to see if there was some DNA genealogy match. Now, when we do that, we don't know what the answer to the question is going to be. So Parabon then will provide us for a fee. In this case, they did it for almost for free because we were doing it at a trial, where they provided us with a possible DNA match to a family member. But that only gets you to a point. So we had a third cousin of the individual who didn't even know this actual suspect.
Wow.
in this particular case. And in some of these cases, that's what's happening, is that the family tree is so far away that we can only go, and how we sort of get ourselves initiated, we actually go and do an interview with a family member to sort of kind of see if we can connect the dots of a family member. For example, in this case, we were able to trace some family members that lived in Germantown that then began to give us some possible leads as to what this individual, and you know, whether it's the sex, the age of the suspect, which we were actually looking for. And again, it gets you to a point, right? We still had investigative work to do in order to actually follow up on that lead, potentially get a DNA sample, because we had enough probable cause that led us to believe that this individual might be potentially our suspect in this particular case. So that's the kind of work that it does, but it kind of, like I said, the most important part is this: it gets you to, off of that, that open source data, that we are able to actually go in, but Parabon, the actual company, is the one that's doing all of the linkage analysis to the DNA sample that we're providing them. And then again, it's a hope and a prayer, right, that we're going to get some sort of a lead that allows us to continue to work that investigation in order to be able to maybe come to a successful closure.
Chief, if I could just throw in one thing too, it's only for a violent crime. We can't do it for like a burglary, and
Right.
somebody, it's only for something as violent crime, or a deceased person that we don't know the identity. We could do it for that too, but it is a violent crime like a homicide or a rape or something along those
Or a
lines.
series.
Yeah.
It's the worst cases we have that we were never able to solve, that we had absolutely nothing more we could work with. One more thing that the chief pointed out is when we reach out to the relative who was identified by the company that we work with, they're under no obligation to speak with us. It's another check and balance on this whole thing. We reach out to them and tell them who we are, why we're contacting them, and then whether they talk to us or not is up to them. There's no compulsion to do so. So far they have, and it's been very interesting. I heard one woman was suspicious as to who we were, and the detectives patiently explained who they were, and she went back and looked up a website and called them back and said, oh, you are who you are. So,
Anywhere you have to be that careful.
absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
And then final question for now, how does our crime lab compare to other jurisdictions? And I ask that for context. We're of course considering legislation right now to establish a partnership or alliance with another law enforcement agency when there is, God forbid, a police-involved shooting in Montgomery County moving forward, which I think in principle the council supports as we all endorse the bill, but we're working through the details of that. Could you talk a little bit about comparing our crime lab capabilities compared to other jurisdictions, or the state for that matter?
Yeah, Frank?
Yeah, I think I can address that. The Maryland State Police really have the broadest set of disciplines that are supported in the state. So they have a lot more technology related to trace analysis. That's really the area where we have the least coverage. Now, in some regard, trace analysis has actually gotten a bit of a bad reputation, because scientifically it doesn't identify a particular item in the way that chemistry does, or in the way, or a person in the way that latent prints or biology does. You're looking for consistencies in the behavior of a metal, or a glass, or another physical component, and you're using that to say that there's a chance that this item is connected in some way to this other standard that you have. And so that's a lot harder argument to make, and it's a lot less valuable in court. So although we don't cover those disciplines, I'm not sure how much value there is in expanding the laboratory to pick them up. Now, if you look further down the list of laboratories, there are 6 in addition to the Maryland State Police in the 6 largest jurisdictions in Maryland. Baltimore City has the next largest. It has SEMs for gunshot residue. It has some more support of these trace sort of activities. Again, they fall in the same category as what I described for trace previously. So again, I'm not sure that, they really provide as much value to the courts or to the investigative process as the disciplines we have. Anne Arundel County, PG County, they support pretty much the same disciplines that we do. Howard County has a little smaller laboratory. They don't support as many disciplines as the rest of the county does. So we're a little on the smaller side than some of these other labs, but we do cover a lot of disciplines given the staffing that we have.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, as everybody said, thanks so much. Yeah, my first time here. Thanks so much for the briefings, very, very helpful, and for your good work. You answered the questions about privacy and about which crimes rise to the level of using Parabon. I know there's a concern out there with some people about whether the use of this technology can implicate an innocent family member, and I wonder if you could address that at all.
Well, there certainly is a lot of polymorphism in the human genome, which enables us to distinguish individuals. And so when you talk about implicating, falsely a family member, given the number of loci that are available in this day and age to compare, the likelihood of that is very low. There's even technology out there recently that I saw described that's getting towards the twin problem, which is that twins, of course, start out with virtually the same DNA sequence. They undergo some mutation during development, and could we in fact develop tools that would look at those areas that were most likely to be mutated? And the answer is yes. So we're actually in a better place today than we were even just a few years ago in regard to addressing that question. But we're talking about 3 billion bases to choose from. We're looking at a relatively small set of loci. There are about 22. There are additional loci available with other chemistries from other sources. We can always add those in order to add some resolution. So I really don't think that it's a huge problem.
Was your question in reference to us finding hitting a false positive by on a family member, or
Because my brother's a real screw up, and I don't want to get blamed.
It's amazing, his brother says the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's the concern that's out there that I've heard from people or read.
So when we receive a DNA match from our laboratory,
Right.
they say that this DNA matches this DNA with a ratio of error is 1 in another number that is far bigger than the entire population of the world.
That's given the
But
normal
not 100%
technology.
certainty.
But not
Right.
100% certainty.
It's a little-
You're always left with a statistical argument in the end.
Right. Not,
And that's because
not-
there is the possibility of, constrained populations and founder's effect and those sorts of things. But really, with the number of loci available, those arguments have become less and less significant as time has progressed. But I think another way to look at your question is whether the tools that Parabon is using have equivalent power and whether they're likely to find potentially a match which in fact is a adventitious match, one that really isn't a genetic match but just happens to share enough alleles and enough loci that it comes up initially. And that's where investigation comes in, of course, and the follow-up of actually acquiring another sample to use with the CODIS loci and the other, more informative loci that are available to sort of add that general resolution. So we wouldn't want to take anyone just based on CODIS evidence and try to incarcerate them, alone. We would always want to follow up and try to refine the test with the tools that we have in order to get those statistics that the captain was speaking about.
Plus, we do a
that we
full
wanna produce.
investigation on it, too. That just gives us the lead, and then
Right.
there's other parts from, the data, the alibi, whatever. It more of the fact
Need a lot
points you
more
to your
evidence than
brother as
that.
being the suspect.
Yes.
And then we, look into a lot more. I don't think we've charged anybody with just a DNA hit.
No,
Right.
we're also aware
There's a full
that,
investigation
No,
that's
that makes
still done.
perfect sense. Right.
Right.
yeah. And in terms of a false positive, we're aware that serial criminals usually are probably also not interested in tracing their genealogy. So they're,
If they're thinking ahead. Right.
And of course, we try to work in the laboratory independent of the investigators so that we're not sort of cross-pollinating information and, producing some sort of bias. So
While
we
this is
take that
a
effort as well.
crime laboratory that works for a law enforcement agency, they take very seriously the fact that they are a neutral body that is looking just for the facts.
And I think everything else I had was answered, but I was curious about the point you made about your competition for personnel. So who do you typically lose people to, or
Well, it
is
depends on the
other
position.
crime labs, or yeah?
Yeah, so of all the disciplines, they're all small pools of professionals. I would say one of the larger pools is probably the crime scene unit personnel, because most major departments have had crime scene units for longer than they've had other units. I think we see the most movement there.
And usually with DC and the Capitol Police, because they have salary levels that are higher than ours for equivalent time in the discipline.
But we have other large departments within a relatively close area, so Baltimore
Right.
City, Baltimore County, Prince George's County, DC. Those are areas. In terms of losing or gaining, it's to these other larger type areas, larger type departments within this area, but we also have federal agencies as well. And
gonna
those
ask about
federal agencies have their own laboratories that are frequently in the DC area. So between.
And our pay is behind theirs as well?
It depends on the position, and it depends on whatever that status is.
Right.
I think there's factors like pay that people look at, but there's also factors like commute, you know? If to work in Montgomery County means making a little bit less money, but you don't have to commute farther into the nation's capital, that might be a deciding factor for somebody.
Right.
One issue that we've been dealing with is the historical generation of the laboratory from the various units that, were distributed differently historically. Under COMAR, all of the units now have to report to a laboratory director with a certain amount of education and experience and all of that. Quite honestly, one reason that we're interested in building the supervisor position was because we had no one within the laboratory who had appropriate experience so they would even qualify for the director's position when it next comes available to be filled. But more of concern to me is pay parity across the disciplines. Right now, we pay the disciplines that were associated historically with FSS less than we pay the ones that were assigned originally to what was called the crime lab back in the day, before they were fused together. And so in some regard, I think we would benefit, because most of the other jurisdictions have done this, to sort of reach some level of pay parity between the disciplines so that we're competitive across the board.
Okay, that's what I got. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it also should be noted that you see it in the newspapers all the time, that somebody has been found not guilty. In fact, sometimes they are incarcerated when they have been found not guilty, because the DNA evidence has come back, and we've gotten more sophisticated in when they were originally tried. Anything else, please?
I did. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the backlog of sexual assault kits, because that was an issue about 2 or 3 years ago that the Attorney General is now involved in. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Montgomery County had about 1,000 case backlog, and that was due largely to the fact that you've never gotten rid of any evidence. And I was wondering if you could just provide an update to the committee on that.
Would you like me to do that? Okay, so just to give you some background information, the laboratory does not operate with the evidence unit as part of our organization. So they are with a different part of the police department. So we're reliant in some regard on them for a source of information as to the total count. All that I can really give you is the number of cases that have been submitted to the biology lab, and for which, we've produced some data. So in fact, I recently acquired that information today. The original count that was provided to us was something on the order of 1,200 cases, and that went up to 1,510 perk kits that have been identified as having historically been untested. Now, in the vast
Was
majority...
what year? What year was that?
Well, the first count was provided in 2016 as a result of a Department of Health inquiry through the laboratories. The most recent counts are, in fact, with the Attorney General's office and the SAC committee, which recently won an award for Maryland to go back and retest these kits, given the circumstances are informative for cases. Now, in most of these cases that we're talking about, they were configured or they were composed of samples from individuals that knew each other. And so they weren't really necessarily going to be very informative from an investigative point of view. So in some regard, we benefited from the fact that we saved them, but I'm not sure how much we're going to benefit now from testing them. But of course, we'll follow the law as it progresses. So what I have here is a total number of kits that were sent in various years. In 2017, we sent 377 cases out to Bodie to be tested. And in 2018, it looks like we sent 109 as of December of 2018. The total number of cases right now that have gone out to Bodie is 548. Now, we've looked at many more than that, but a number of them are just not suited to testing. And so in that regard, we are getting data back from these. We're actually putting them through the normal process. Trying to look. 75 of the cases from those original numbers that I provided, in fact, required technical review, which meant that they had data that was informative towards the conclusions of inclusion or exclusion. And of course, we have entry of those 58 of those cases into CODIS, and we acquired 15 hits from those CODIS cases. So we have yielded something from this effort.
Good. Okay, does that answer your question? Any other questions, please?
Just on the pay parity issue, have we followed up with the Office of Human Resources on that? Is there an analysis or studying being done?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, we'll work. We're working with OHR, and we continue to kind of assess that.
Great.
Because we knew that there were some pay parity issues with our certain positions, but that's still something with our personnel division that we'll continue to work with them on. Okay.
And can you explain, please, when you're saying it's not suitable for testing? What does that mean?
Well, that means that either the sample was not collected or the quality of the sample is insufficient to yield a profile.
I see.
One of the constraints that have been applied to the application or the use of DNA in recent times is to try to be a little more restrictive in interpreting signals to make sure that they go past various thresholds and such, make sure that they're of sufficient strength to really qualify as appropriate signals to interpret. And so that's really where, you have to make that judgment about whether a sample is appropriate or not to.
And then I think we also talk about, when Frank, we were talking about the PERC kits, where you have a situation where the victim knew who the suspect was. So there's really not a debate about a DNA test that needs to be made based upon an interview that might say, yes, I had sex with this person. The situation is whether it was consensual or non-consensual.
Right.
And that's usually the debate. And so there's really not a need for us to actually have to test it because we know who the perpetrator is if it's such. So there's no need. That's why some of those test kits that sit on our shelves, really, there's no need for us to test them in that if that's the category that they would fall under.
Got it.
So.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you all very, very much for what you do and for being here. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you for having us. All right. Good to see you. Absolutely. Thank you, Susan.